Hello and welcome to CBT Nuggets Introduction to VMware Virtual Infrastructure. I'm Greg Shields. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to spend a lot of quality time together talking not only about VMware, the workstation side of it, and not only about VMware, the server side of it, but all of the things you need to know that encompass virtualization and how you can incorporate virtualization into your network successfully. Now, one of the things I think that is a good takeaway from this series that I think you'll find as we move throughout this series is not only really understanding the bits and bytes about how VMware works, but also really getting a feel for some of the better ways to construct your virtual infrastructure. I'm hoping that as you complete this series, you'll not only educate yourself based on virtualization and based on VMware, but based on some really good ways so that you can ensure better uptime in your environment, so that you can ensure that your servers stay up, that your servers stay healthy, and that you can incorporate some of the neat features and functionality that virtualization provides to help your network be just that much more stable, so that you can involve compression, so you can bring servers together and reduce your signature in your data center, and just really have that much better of a an infrastructure based on moving towards a virtual infrastructure. So as we work through these next few hours, we're going to have a lot of good conversations on really what is virtualization and why do we want to use virtualization. Now, obviously virtualization there's a lot of different types of virtualization out there, and one of the I guess the confusions about virtualization involves which of the different types of virtualization are out there. And one of the things that we want to talk about is really what is virtualization. Now, there are things like application virtualization out there that encapsulates applications into little bubbles, if you will, that prevent application conflicts from occurring. There's a concept of para-virtualization out there where you're actually virtualizing, snapshotting the operating system and creating a virtualization or virtual environments based on those snapshots. The type of virtualization that VMware uses is, and this is my term, is essentially whole system virtualization. And what VMware does is essentially creates this very, very thin layer, this thin shim layer, if you will, that is an operating system that resides between your physical resources on your servers and then proxies information back and forth between those physical resources and the virtual machines which reside on top of it. You're going to be making use of the VMware operating system, again, both from the workstation standpoint at the beginning of this series, and then we're going to take what we've learned in this very short period of workstation information and move it into ESX, into the server, and then the enterprise-based version of VMware. Now, why do you want to use it, and also when you shouldn't you use it is a really important question as well, and we're going to talk about that here in the next slide as well. It's important to know that there are some cases in which virtualization may not necessarily be the best idea or the best solution for you, and we want to really kind of talk about when it's a good idea and when it's not. What we hope, or what I hope that you'll get out of this, is how best to build, configure, and operate a virtual infrastructure inside of your network. You know, and we're going to take not only kind of the textbook explanation of what is virtualization, but we're also going to take my own personal experience and the best practices that I've derived over in countless virtual infrastructure installations, and also the subsequent troubleshooting and all that stuff involved with it. So hopefully, between the combination of what is the book smarts and also the common sense smarts, we can put those together to help you really get a better understanding of how to best deploy your virtual infrastructure, how to best architect it in the first place, and then once it's running, how best to operate it so that you can get the most out of it. You know, admittedly, VMware is kind of an expensive solution. You got to buy storage area networks, you got to buy the VMware software, you got to buy all these high-end machines. And so if you're going to spend all this upfront cost, then you want to make sure that you get the most bang for the buck out of that upfront cost. And it's really not that hard to do. The cost models are very compelling when it comes to VMware in terms of virtualization. The question we have to ask at this part is really, why are we interested in virtualization? Now, obviously, you bought this series. You went out and said, you know what? I want to know more about virtualization, and I want to know more about VMware. So obviously, there is some interest on your part in what is the technology. Maybe you're getting ready to deploy it, or maybe you're thinking about deploying, and you want to educate yourself. And maybe you just like CBT Nuggets, and you're viewing this video because it happens to be one on your list. But you're choosing this video series is because you have have an interest in virtualization, you or your business. Now, why is it compelling? What is really compelling about moving towards virtualized environments? And the very first item up here that we list is something that I like talking about because it's the concept of compression, and that's sort of a Greg term. But essentially, what I'm saying by using the term compression is when you use virtualization, you can take lots and lots of physical machines and squish them down from maybe 10 or 15 physical machines, squish them down into a single server, and having those 10 to 15 servers residing as virtual servers on top of that server. Now, when you think about this compression percentage, the more that I can compress servers down into virtual servers onto single virtual servers, that means that it's more efficient use of processor resources, more efficient use of system resources. Think about this, right? Moore's law has hit, what, 5 or 6 times over the last 12 years or so. Moore's law is the idea that every 18 to 24 months that processing power doubles. And really the changes in our operating systems has not really happened all that much. In the Microsoft world, we've had, 2 or 3 or changes in the operating system in the same time that we've had 5 or 6 strikes of Moore's law. And so what's happened is that over time, we now begin to think of our servers as being fully utilized in our environment, and we start deploying servers out there, but really these servers are only being utilized somewhere between 3 and 5% of the time. And then that's really the industry standard right now, is that with all physical Windows servers right now, the average utilization for that Windows server resides somewhere in the 3 to 5% range. Now, that being said, if you think about it, right, if you had an employee that was only being efficient and utilized 3 to 5% of the time, would you keep that employee around in your environment? Probably not. That's not really good efficiency for an employee. You wouldn't pay their salary if they're only doing good work for you 3% of the time. But for some reason, we have gotten to the point where we believe that our physical servers can sit at that 3 to 5% utilized rate, and that's considered okay. Well, what virtualization does essentially is allow us to again compress those machines down so we can take 10 of these servers that are running at 3% utilization and squish them together into one virtual server, and now we have a virtual server that's not running at 3%, but it's running at 30%. If the individual servers are running at 5%, now it's running at 50%. So the compression of these physical servers down into virtual servers allows us to get more efficient use of our physical resources. And so we don't have to go and buy these Windows servers. A Windows server costs you what, $5,000-$6,000 these days, and if it's only getting used 3% of the time, you're really not getting the best efficiency out of it. Also, the problem with Windows servers is that not only do they occupy space, but because they're running and they're constantly on, we have to power them as well. And because they're generating heat as they're powered, we also have to keep them cool. And that process actually consumes money. I mean, it takes dollars and cents for us to be able to store those servers, to power them up, and to cool them down. An average Windows server probably, just some round numbers here, an average Windows server that's a domain controller or a low-end Exchange server, those sorts of things. It's a dual processor, 4 gigs of RAM, that sort of stuff. Consumes not quite about 300 watts of electricity. And if you're burning about 8.5 cents per kilowatt hour, you're talking like $200 or $300 a year just to power that single server. And due to the way that physics works, whenever you pay to power something, you also have to pay to cool it, and that pretty much doubles the amount of cost that it takes in order to keep that server up and operational. And I'm talking about powered and cooled as well. You also, especially if you're leasing your data center space, you're also having to pay for the square footage of that server space as well. And so if we can, again, compress down these servers so that you have one server that's performing 10 or 15 functions, instead of 10 or 15 servers that are each performing an additional function, you can substantially reduce the cost that it takes to not only store, but power and cool those servers as well. There's server refresh costs that are important as well. With Microsoft, they've changed the rules in licensing. So if you buy the standard edition of Microsoft licensing, you really get 1 for 1. But if you buy the enterprise version of Microsoft licensing, then for every physical server you get 4 free virtual server licenses as well. That's like getting buy 1 get 4 for free. If you buy the data center version of Microsoft, then now you can get unlimited virtual servers out of that copy of data center Windows. And so whenever you have to go and add servers or replace servers or upgrade servers or or refresh the servers because their equipment is getting old, you can substantially reduce the amount of cost that it takes to do that server refresh because you don't really have to refresh them as much anymore. There's fewer servers to refresh. And when you do refresh them, the virtual servers have the same virtual hardware. And so the process to move servers from one chassis class to another is relatively trivial. You also have better management because now you don't have to think about, oh, do I have to go buy KVMs and IP KVMs and how do I connect to my servers and where are all of my servers? All of your servers are attached to via single interface, the virtual infrastructure client, which we'll talk about thoroughly throughout this entire series. And so you have the ability to do better management. You also have this snapshotting capability. And one of the neat and nifty components about virtualization is this ability to say, okay, take a snapshot of yourself. Now, why is this useful? It's useful because when you hit that button and you take that snapshot, you've essentially frozen that server at a point in time that you could potentially revert back to if something goes wrong. Now, think about the monthly patch cycle, right? You're getting ready to go apply your Microsoft patches, and then you go, you know what, I'm going to snapshot this server. You hit the snapshot button, and maybe the patch blue screens the server because of some problem with the patch. Well, it's very easy to go and revert back to that snapshot. So the management of your servers becomes much easier and much more stable as well because you have the ability to reduce any of these inconsistencies associated with adding new software and adding patches and those sorts of things. One of the big deals about virtualization is that the ability to distribute out access to the console. You know, one of the hardest parts about providing access to consoles for non-administrative users, for non-IT users, we've all had to do it at some point. You've got some non-IT guy that needs to get into the data center because he's got one server that needs to deal with, and you don't want to give him the key card because that gives him keys to the castle, but you have to because he needs to get on the console. Well, if we could remote that console to the user, whether it be through a web interface or through a rich interface using the virtual infrastructure client, we can more securely distribute that console access to non-IT users so that we can further eliminate the need for people to go in and out of the data center. We also have disaster recovery capabilities that become enlightened for us and also much more affordable for us once we move into virtualization. As you move into virtualization, you get some new and neat disaster recovery options that allow you to snapshot your servers and then send them over the wire to a backup site where they're available and ready should your primary site get nuked or hit by a tornado. So you have these abilities that weren't really there before or were way out of the ballpark in terms of price that allow you to do disaster recovery for your environment. Now, there are some industries in which this disaster recovery stuff is becoming really a hot topic because of the regulations required to keep the site up. Think of the banking industries. If you're in the banking industry right now, you have to really consider having some sort of disaster recovery plan because the regulations associated with disaster recovery are telling you that you need to have it. So depending on the size of the bank, you may actually have to have a disaster recovery site, and implementing it in virtualization means that it's done with much less cost to you because of the way virtualization encapsulates all of those files into a single VMDK file. Now, obviously, any discussion about why virtualization is good is really incomplete unless we talk about when it's not all that good. You know, we can't just talk about the positives here. We have to talk about the negatives as well. Now, one of the most interesting negatives that I see is I've gone around and done a bunch of these virtualization deployments is that as the virtual software has matured, and this is not only VMware, but the other software out there as well, the virtual software itself at this point is relatively bomb-proof. I mean, the stuff just works. It's very mature. It's very stable. The stuff just works. The biggest problem in any virtual infrastructure rollout really is the administrator, because it becomes now so very easy for you to accidentally power off a system or accidentally do things that are really bad. Really, the soft spot, the weak link in a lot of these virtual infrastructure deployments is you, the administrator. Now, obviously, you've bought this series, which means that you are interested in making sure that you do just the right things and you've got the right education so that you're doing and administering your virtual infrastructure correctly. And so the first bullet point here is kind of moot because we're in the process now of completing this education so that you know that you've got the right bits and bytes necessary to do this appropriately. One of the other big issues with virtualization is that once you implement virtualization into your environment, one of the things that tends to happen is what I call server bloat. And that is, Hey, look how easy it is for me to build a new virtual server. Poof, let me just do another one. Poof, let me just do another one. And before you know it, you went from having 10 servers down to one server with 10 virtual servers and up to 20 virtual servers because it's so easy to create new virtual servers. So one of the things you have to be very conscious about whenever you're doing virtualization is still making the correct decisions about when to add new servers and when to add new services and when not to add new servers. Because again, just because it's easy to do so doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go down that road, because every additional server still consumes another Windows license or another license of that operating system. If you have any kind of fear of Linux, if you have any kind of fear of any of the Starnix OSs at all, then VMware Virtual Infrastructure may not be for you. Where now, with the 3.0 version of VMware ESX, most of the need to dig deep into the Linux to actually do the configuration and the administration has gone away. But there is still some need to actually be able to go into the service console and make some manipulation of the Linux. You can't get away from it completely, especially during the initial configuration. And so if you have like a deep-rooted fear of Linux and you just can't get over that fear of Linux, then VMware may not be the solution for you. There are other products out there that don't involve any sort of Linux whatsoever. And then lastly, there is, depending on what kind of feature sets you're looking for, there really is a high upfront cost for those best features. You know, people are most excited about vMotion and the ability to hot migrate systems from one chassis to another without having to power them off or without them ever losing a transaction. And admittedly, that vMotion technology is really compelling. It's just downright cool. But the problem with the vMotion technology is that it not only costs money for the operating system, it not only costs money for the VMware software, but you've got to buy fiber channel HBAs or iSCSI connections and storage area networks and storage area network brocade switches and all of the high upfront costs that are associated for the best features. Now, that's not to say that you can buy the lower end versions of VMware. Even the VMware Starter Edition, which doesn't include any support for storage area networks, which only includes support for direct attached storage, is still really compelling because a lot of the features you get are still available there. But the niftiest features, the best features that we put here, called down here in the bottom, those features are those vMotion based features, and really there's a high upfront cost for those. So when you do your analysis and determination of what kind of software you need to purchase for your VMware, just consider that there is a high upfront cost for those best features. And if you don't need them, then don't buy them, because you can always later on go back. If maybe this year you can buy the lower end version of VMware, and the next year you could buy the storage area network, and then the year after you can buy the enterprise edition of VMware, and then you can phased approach in all of this stuff depending on what your needs are. So this is really why not virtualization. The question then is, how are we going to approach going through the education throughout this series? Now, what we're going to start out with really is VMware Workstation. And if you're groaning because you're like, oh my God, I know VMware Workstation, I've been playing with Workstation forever. Well, the reason why we're starting with Workstation is specifically with VMware Workstation 6.0. There is some advancements to VMware Workstation 6.0 over the previous version of Workstation that allow us to actually build virtual infrastructure of ESX servers inside of Workstation. And we're going to start actually with doing some of this education. We're going to talk about VMware Workstation for just a little bit of time, for about 3 of the first nuggets here, so that we make sure that we've got the initial concepts out of the way, so we understand what those initial concepts are associated with virtualization, and we can take those and move those into the ESX and into the higher end stuff. What I think you'll find is that getting a real good understanding of Workstation will help you do better in understanding more thoroughly what your ESX infrastructure is. And also, and we'll talk about this in a second, by understanding Workstation, you'll also be able to build your own ESX infrastructure inside of Workstation as well. Let's take a look here at my VMware Workstation. Now, this is something I bet you never thought you'd see, right? This is an instance of ESX Server version 3.0.1 that is currently residing inside of VMware Workstation. For all previous versions of Workstation, it was always known throughout time that you couldn't do that. Well, things have changed. Workstation 6.0 now allows you to build ESX infrastructures inside of Workstation, and that's really cool because now you on your laptop or your desktop, if it is of sufficient power, if it is powerful enough, you can actually build this and demonstrate the use and the power of VMware ESX inside of your laptop. And you can use it for evaluation and testing and learning and maybe even studying for the VCP exam. You can do it all here inside of VMware Workstation. Now, I want to stop for just a second because there are some pretty hefty requirements on resources for you to be able to really use VMware Workstation to host ESX. You can see here, first of all, that we are simultaneously running 3 systems on this server right now. An ESX Nugget 1, an OpenFiler, and VC Nugget, all of these are using pretty substantial quantities of RAM at this point. Now, if you're going to do this, if you want to demonstrate this inside of Workstation, one of the key components is that the system that you buy needs to be a relatively new system with a newer processor class. And the reason for that is because there are some new processor features called, in Intel they're called the VT extensions, in AMD they're called the SVM extensions. And you have to be able to have those level of extensions for this to really work, and they have to be enabled on your system. So take a look at your processor class. Make sure that your processor, if it's in Intel, it's a E6000 or greater. If it's an AMD, it's Rev F or greater, so that you have these virtualization extensions. Again, it's Intel, it's VT, it's AMD, it's SVM. You have to have them, and you have to have them installed, and you have to have them ready to go for this to work. If you don't have it, you can still do ESX server, but instead of booting up in 90 seconds, it boots up in, 8 hours because of all of the benefits the VT extensions provide for you. So this is actually the infrastructure that throughout this series we're going to begin by building, then we're going to configure, and then we're going to show how to operate it. So we're going to do this throughout the next 20 nuggets. And if you want to do this at home, you can do this at home as well. So having that is a really good idea as well. We're going to start with Workstation. We're going to learn those Workstation components and use those to build our ESX server. Once we've built our ESX server, then we're going to move into some other things like data stores and networking and connecting into to hard drives and sharing hard drives. And then we're going to take that, once that's fully completed, and move that into virtual infrastructure. So we can talk about vMotion, we can talk about DRS and HA and all those fun things that are really exciting about VMware. Some of the things that aren't going to be covered in this Nugget series is involved with GSX or server. There is a free version of VMware server or VMware ESX called VMware Server that runs on top of an existing operating system, whether that be Windows or a Linux. And we're not going to cover that, but the terminology, the concepts you'll learn here will flow directly into server. Also ACE, VMware's Assured Computing Environment, is another tool that essentially wraps kind of a management skin around Workstation to allow you to create a versioning and to approve and disapprove versions associated with virtual machines so that you can set out specific virtual machines that your people use for specific reasons. We're not going to talk about Lab Manager, which allows you to automatically deploy or much better deploy machines out for lab purposes or for dev test or for development purposes. But this is, again, another skin on top of Workstation that allows you to more rapidly deploy those systems. And we're not going to cover VMware Player, which is the free version of Workstation, which doesn't allow you to really create any VMs, but allows you to use those VMs and play those VMs as you would a regular player. And really, though, again, if you understand the 3 major components of VMware, then you're really going to understand these minor components of VMware as well. And not to call them minor, but they're sort of tack-on technologies that are useful in certain instances. So this is really what we're talking about, what we're going to discuss over the next couple of nuggets here. What are some prerequisites you need to know? Now, obviously, we have to have some sort of base level of knowledge so that we can all talk intelligently when it comes to this knowledge transfer. And the prerequisites that I'm really putting up here so that you feel that you're going to be ready to learn and understand what we're talking about is obviously an understanding of the Windows operating system. You probably at this point have a pretty decent understanding of the Windows operating system. And really, when we say this, I'm saying this because you have to really understand how do you configure networking? How do you get yourself in a domain? How do you, do some of the minor stuff associated with systems administration, basic systems administration of the Windows OS? I'm not going to tell you either that you have to have an understanding of the Linux OS, but at least having no fear of the Linux OS is going to be very handy for you as well. We are going to, in one of the very late nuggets, in fact, the second to last one, we're going to go over the service console and also what are some commands, some basic Linux commands that you'll need in order to help administer your operating system. So you get kind of a Linux 101 out of this as well. You need to have some basic knowledge of virtualization concept, and I mean basic because we're gonna start with some of the basics. And if you just really have an understanding, and I would say more an enthusiasm for those virtualization concepts, then you're going to do really well with this knowledge transfer. you need to have a basic knowledge of some network and storage topics. And very specifically, you need to understand from the system side how networking works and also how storage works, specifically storage area networks, fiber channel, iSCSI, NFS, those sorts of things. Because we're going to talk about them, but we're only going to talk about them from the ESX side. There's going to be some components, some setup on the storage area network side that you'll need to know as well. And it's really out of scope for this because we can't spend all kinds of time talking about how to configure your Hitachi or your EMC or your left-hand networks or any of those. We need to spend time on making sure you understand how VMware connects into those environments. And most importantly, desire to learn. And I always put this on my slides because having a real interest and enthusiasm for this product means that you're really going to enjoy this series. You're going to enjoy listening to my voice for the next 7 or 8 hours. And you're going to really appreciate the knowledge that you're going to gain by sitting down and learning about all of this stuff and getting to see all these neat and fun demos that we're going to do over the next period of time. So these are really the prerequisites for what we're going to talk about. What specifically are we going to talk about? I put up here what I'm calling the course outline, and this really is the 20 nuggets that we're going to be reviewing throughout this series. We're going to start here with this nugget, which is the introduction to virtualization in VMware, and we're going to take what we've learned there and use and understand VMware Workstation. We're going to look at VMware Workstation, we're going to deploy some machines, we're going to manipulate and convert some virtual machines, we're going to talk about cloning and teaming, which will flow directly into our discussion of ESX and how we install ESX and how we configure ESX and how we configure the networking for ESX and virtual switches for ESX. I think you're really going to enjoy all the neat functionality associated with virtual switches in the ESX infrastructure. Once we've talked about networking, we're going to talk about storage. We're going to move into 3 different types of storage: fiber channel, iSCSI, and NFS storage. These are the 3 ways that you can create shared storage where a virtual machine can sit in a central location and be attached to and talked to by multiple ESX servers. And depending on what type of storage you may have, whether it be a storage area network that's fiber channel or iSCSI, or even some Unix servers with NFS, you'll find that you'll have different capabilities and different levels of performance associated with these different types of storage. Once we've talked about switches and storage, we'll talk about licensing and installing Virtual Center, which moves us away from ESX and more into the central administration of ESX using Virtual Center. And then this moves into our discussion of virtual infrastructure. We're going to talk about the Virtual Center interface and all the neat things that you can do inside of Virtual Center and how to deploy virtual machines. And then we'll move into vMotion and how to do vMotion, which is considered a hot migration. We'll also talk about cold migration. Then we'll go into some of the more advanced vMotion topics like resource and performance management and clusters and resource pools and DRS and HA. And then we'll talk about operating your existing environment, like administering user permissions and administering web access. And then a very good discussion on backup and restore and disaster recovery. And we'll wrap up with some service console commands and how to use the Linux and how to dig deep into SSHing into your server, and then some troubleshooting and how to manipulate the logs associated with your server. So what we're doing is we're starting out with the design, we're starting out with the core knowledge, we're moving through the installation, we're moving through the configuration and the attachment to storage and networking, we're moving through the operations and the setup, and then we're finishing off with some of the topics that really you need to think about when you're doing that architecture, like backup and restore, and also using the Linux associated with it as well. So throughout this series, I think you're going to get a chance to touch on all of the major topics associated with VMware and virtualization and VMware's solution for virtualization as well. So understanding that, we're going to be building over a period of time what I call here our CBT Nuggets network. And you see there's a little Visio diagram here that talks about all the different systems that over a period of time we're going to be discussing. Right here in this triangle here, we have what I'm calling nuggetlab.com. And that's the Windows Active Directory domain, nuggetlab.com, which is hosted by the server DC Nugget right up here. DC Nugget is the domain controller, and all it does is service this nuggetlab.com. We need to have an Active Directory infrastructure because the Virtual Center instance requires an Active Directory infrastructure to really kind of power its users and groups and those sorts of things. And so what we're going to do is we are going to build an ESX server. This is ESX Nugget 1. We're going to build a second ESX server, Nugget 2, and we're also going to create an instance here called OpenFiler, which is a open source tool for creating iSCSI data stores. That OpenFiler instance will be connecting to an iSCSI data store and also an NFS data store as well, so that we can see the connections to iSCSI and we can see the connections to NFS. We will be showing also a demonstration of a production instance of a fiber channel connection as well. Not not necessarily using OpenFiler, but using a different in-production interface. And we'll talk about that when we get into Fiber Channel. Once we've created these connections to ESX or these instances of ESX, we will use this server VC Nugget, the virtual center server, to manage ESX Nugget 1 and manage ESX Nugget 2 using this iSCSI data store using OpenFiler. And once we've done that, we'll actually build a couple of virtual machines, Nugget 1 and Nugget 2, that will reside on top of ESX Nugget 1 and ESX Nugget 2. So you can see here we've got a pretty large network that we're going to be building over the period of this series, because we're going to have to show all of the features and functionality of VMware. And this kind of drives home why, if you're going to try to demonstrate this in your local environment, if you want to try to mock this up while you're listening along to this series, you're going to need systems that have quite a bit of power, because essentially we're going to be running 7 different systems all at once. So be very aware that there's going to be some pretty substantial processing horsepower required if you're going to try to mock this up inside a VMware workstation. So really, this is the network, and this is the network we're going to be using over the next period of time. I think we're really going to have a lot of fun over this series, because VMware is one of those just downright cool sorts of technologies, and really working it into your environment and getting it into your environment is something that we as systems administrators, I think, are really kind of excited about, because there's such neat stuff associated with VMware, and it's so easy to use and so robust in what it can do. In addition to what we're going to talk about today, there are some additional resources that you might want to take a look at to help you with the process of learning about VMware. Obviously, VMware.com has got the documentation and also the VM Technology Network and the support forums. Really, the VMware support forums is an excellent place for troubleshooting. If you've got problems with your ESX server, my suggestion is you start with the support forums on VMware.com, because the people there are really enlightened about VMware, and they're excited about it, and they've got a lot of good information that they can pass on to you. There are a couple of third-party sites, some blog sites, some community sites that you can take a look at as well. There's this www.rtfm-co.uk. That's Mike Laverick, a buddy of mine. Mike Laverick's got a blog site where he does a lot of work on VMware and produces some great collateral that can help you understand more about VMware and also up-to-date information about it as well. Alessandro over at virtualization.info also has some great market news, what's going on in the world of VMware from the business perspective as well, and also some good technology information there as well. And then also, and this is full disclosure, this is my Windows Server community here, and I suggest not only Windows Server, but also Windows topics and virtualization topics and VMware topics as well. And I suggest you take a look at www.realtime-windowsserver.com, where we've got some great topics, again, not only having to do with Windows Server, but having to do with virtualization and things that would interest you because you're interested in this particular series. So really, I think we're going to have a great time with this series. And by the end of it, you should really understand all of the major components of VMware to help you understand the installation, setup, configuration, and operations of your virtual infrastructure. If you're considering taking the VCP exam as well, what you learn here will go far into helping you understand what you need to know in order to take that VCP exam as well. Again, I'm Greg Shields, and welcome to the CBT Nuggets Intro to VMware Virtual Infrastructure. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to working with you and learning with you and being a part of your knowledge transfer associated with VMware. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.